January 1945, the frozen silence of Versailles. The winter of 1944–45 was one of the coldest in recorded European history. A bitter, biting freeze that seemed to seep through the stone walls of the Trianon Palace Hotel in Versailles. Inside, in the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, the atmosphere was even colder. It was mid-January 1945. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, sat behind his desk, waiting. He was a man known for his legendary grin, his Kansas charm, and his seemingly infinite reservoir of patience. He was the chairman of the board, the glue holding together the most complex military alliance in human history. But on this day, the grin was gone. The patience had evaporated. Eisenhower was waiting for Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery for months. The tension between the American Supreme Commander and Britain's most celebrated field general had been building like pressurized steam. It was a clash of personalities, of national egos, and of strategic philosophies. But mostly, it was a clash of authority. Montgomery had spent the better part of the war complaining, criticizing, and publicly undermining Eisenhower's strategy. He had claimed credit for American victories. He had lobbied British Prime Minister Winston Churchill to strip Eisenhower of ground command. He had treated senior American generals men like Omar Bradley and George Patton like incompetent subordinates who needed a British tutor. Today, however, the dynamic was about to shift permanently. Eisenhower had decided that the era of diplomatic management was over. What was about to happen in that room would end Montgomery's influence over American forces forever. It was the moment when the diplomat disappeared, and the Supreme Commander emerged to deliver a brutal ultimatum: shut up, fall in line, or get out. To understand the magnitude of this confrontation, a clash that nearly tore the Allied command apart mere months before the end of the war, one must understand the long, toxic road that led to Versailles. The architect of friction, Bernard Montgomery, was without question a military genius. The victor of Ultimatum, he was the man who had given Britain its first major land victory against the Nazis. He was a brilliant tactician, a careful planner who refused to move until he was certain of victory, and a commander who deeply cared for the lives of his men. But these virtues came packaged in a personality that was famously impossible. Montgomery was ascetic, arrogant, and politically tone-deaf. He lacked the social graces that smoothed the friction of coalition warfare. To Montgomery, war was a mathematical problem to be solved by a single master intellect, his own. He viewed himself not just as a senior commander, but as the only professional soldier in a room full of enthusiastic amateurs. He regarded Eisenhower as a nice chap, but militarily illiterate, a political appointee suited for boardrooms, not battlefields. The friction began in North Africa and Sicily, but it metastasized after D-Day. During the initial invasion of Normandy in June 1944, Montgomery had served as the ground forces commander for all Allied troops. It was a temporary arrangement, necessary for coordination during the beachhead phase. But Montgomery behaved as if the position were permanent. When Eisenhower formally took direct command of ground operations on September 1, 1944, Montgomery was apoplectic. He viewed it as a demotion. He believed, with utter conviction, that he alone possessed the military genius required to lead the final push into Germany. From that moment on, Montgomery became a constant, festering thorn in Eisenhower's side. The strategic divide, broad front versus the dagger. The conflict wasn't just personal. It was strategic. Eisenhower favored a broad front strategy, advancing across the entire length of the German border to stretch the Wehrmacht's defenses and allow the full weight of American industrial superiority to crush the enemy. Montgomery despised this approach. He argued vociferously for a single thrust, a concentrated, pencil-thin strike into the heart of Germany, specifically the Ruhr Industrial Valley, under his command. He argued that if Eisenhower gave him all the fuel, all the ammunition, and all the reserves, he could end the war by Christmas 1944. Eisenhower, balancing the political needs of the alliance and the logistical realities of supply lines, refused. Montgomery took this refusal as a personal slight and a strategic catastrophe. He began a campaign of subtle insubordination. He lobbied Churchill constantly, writing letters that disparaged Eisenhower's competence. He gave press conferences where he subtly mocked the Broad Front as a waste of time. He treated General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. 12th Army Group, with barely concealed contempt, referring to the American armies as if they were auxiliary units to his British 21st Army Group. Eisenhower absorbed it all. He was the conciliator. He knew the alliance needed Britain, and he knew the British public worshipped Montgomery. So Ike smiled. He compromised. He smoothed over ruffled feathers. He defended Montgomery when American generals demanded his head. Then came December 16, 1944, the crisis, the Battle of the Bulge in the freezing fog of the Ardennes. Adolf Hitler launched his last desperate gamble, a massive counteroffensive designed to split the Allied armies. The attack slammed into the American lines, creating a massive bulge in the front. Chaos reigned. Communications were cut, units were isolated, and panic threatened to set in. Eisenhower acted decisively. Recognizing that the German advance had physically separated General Bradley's headquarters in the south from the American armies in the north, Eisenhower made a pragmatic, operational decision. He temporarily transferred command of the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies, over 200,000 American soldiers, to Field Marshal Montgomery's command in the north to ensure cohesive leadership on that flank. It was a military necessity, not a political statement. But Montgomery saw it as vindication. To Montgomery, this transfer of command was proof that he had been right all along. He believed it demonstrated that American commanders crumbled in a crisis and required British supervision to survive. While American troops fought and died in the snow holding the shoulder of the Bulge at Elsenburn Ridge and Bastogne with grim determination, Montgomery began to strut. He delayed his counterattack, infuriating American commanders who were desperate to pinch off the German salient. He lectured American generals on the basics of defense. But the breaking point came after the battle was won, the press conference that broke the alliance on January 7, 1945. With the German offensive halted and the Allies pushing back, Montgomery held a press conference. It was intended to be a briefing on the operational situation. Instead, it became one of the most disastrous public relations blunders of the war. Montgomery walked into the room radiating superiority. In his remarks, he described the battle as if he were a schoolmaster who had stepped in to tidy up a mess made by unruly children. He essentially claimed credit for saving the Americans from disaster. He described the operation as one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled, implying that only his genius had prevented a collapse, while he paid lip service to the good fighting qualities of the American soldier. The tone was unmistakable. He made it sound as though the British had rescued the Americans. He failed to mention that for every one British casualty in the battle, there were 40 American casualties. He failed to credit Bradley or Patton adequately. The reaction was immediate and volcanic when the news reached American headquarters. General Omar Bradley, a man usually known for his calm demeanor, turned purple with rage. He told Eisenhower that he would resign his commission rather than serve under Montgomery again. George Patton, never one for subtlety, suggested that he and Montgomery should settle their differences with pistols at dawn, but the anger wasn't limited to the generals. The American press exploded. Newspapers ran editorials asking if the United States was merely providing blood and treasure for British glory. General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff in Washington, the man who controlled Eisenhower's job, sent a telegram to Versailles. His message was clear. This cannot continue. The alliance was fracturing. Eisenhower realized that his policy of patience had failed. Diplomacy had become enabling. By trying to keep the peace, he was risking the war. He knew he had to act, and he knew he had to be brutal. Asterisk. The confrontation, the meeting was scheduled for mid-January. The exact date remains a subject of debate among historians because no official transcript was entered into the SHAFE. Records likely because the conversation was too explosive to be preserved in government files. However, through the diaries of Eisenhower's naval aide, Harry Butcher, his chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, and later British accounts, we can reconstruct the scene before Montgomery arrived. Eisenhower sat with Bedell Smith. The Supreme Commander was finished with compromise. "I'm done being diplomatic with Monty," Eisenhower reportedly said, his voice flat and hard. "If he can't accept my authority, then he can go home." Smith, who had spent months smoothing over Montgomery's insults, replied, "About damn time." "Sir," when Montgomery walked into Eisenhower's office, he was expecting a debate. He anticipated another round of strategic wrangling, perhaps another opportunity to press his case for the single-thrust command. He walked in with his usual air of confidence, perhaps even expecting praise for the Bulge. He found Eisenhower standing behind his desk, his face set like granite. There were no handshakes, no offers of tea. The meeting lasted barely 30 minutes, but it changed the course of the war. Eisenhower began by addressing the press conference. "Your remarks to the press have caused serious damage to Allied unity," he said, his voice low but cutting. "American generals are furious. American newspapers are calling for your dismissal, and I'm not sure I disagree with them." Montgomery, taken aback, attempted to defend himself. He tried to explain that he had been praising the American soldier, that the press had twisted his words, that his intentions were pure. Eisenhower cut him off with a sharpness that startled the field marshal. "I don't care about your intentions. I care about results. And the result is that you've made the Americans question whether this is truly a partnership or whether we're just here to provide men and material for British glory, then." Eisenhower dismantled the core of Montgomery's ambition. "You seem to believe you should be running this campaign," Ike said. "You've made that clear in every conversation we've had since September. So let me make something equally clear. You're not running this campaign. I am. And if you can't accept that, then I'll ask Churchill to relieve you of command." The ultimatum, according to accounts from staff briefed immediately after, Montgomery attempted to pivot back to strategy. He started to lecture Eisenhower on the operational benefits of a single commander for the ground war. Eisenhower stood up. He leaned over the desk, looking the victor of El Alamein directly in the eye. "Bernard," Eisenhower said, using the field marshal's first name to strip away the formality of rank. "I'm going to say this once, and I need you to understand that I mean every word. You have two choices." The room fell silent. "You can accept my command authority without reservation. Stop lobbying Churchill for my job. Stop criticizing American generals and stop giving press conferences that undermine Allied unity." Eisenhower let the words hang in the air before delivering the alternative. "Or you can refuse, and I will personally request your relief from command. Those are your only options." It was the shut up or get out moment. The phrase itself likely originated from Churchill's chief of staff, General Hastings Ismay, or perhaps Churchill himself, who had warned Montgomery earlier that he was on thin ice. But now, Eisenhower was delivering it with the full weight of the United States behind him. Eisenhower continued, twisting the knife by highlighting the new geopolitical reality. "I need to be clear about something else. The American army is now the dominant force in this theater. We are fielding more divisions, providing more equipment, and taking more casualties than Britain. That's not a criticism. It's a fact. And it means that American concerns carry weight. When American generals tell me they can't work with you, I have to listen. Then came the personal blow, the assessment that shattered Montgomery's self-image. You're a brilliant tactician. No one disputes that. But you lack political judgment. And in a coalition war, political judgment matters as much as tactical skill. I've defended you repeatedly after the slapping incidents with Patton, after your slow advance at Cannes, after countless complaints from American commanders. But I can't defend you anymore. Not after this. The capitulation. Montgomery stood there, pale and shaken. He had miscalculated. For years he had relied on the belief that he was indispensable, that the political cost of firing Britain's greatest hero was too high for Eisenhower to pay. He suddenly realized that the math had changed. The Americans were winning the war. They had the men, the tanks, and the momentum. He was no longer indispensable. He was a liability. What Montgomery said next reveals how completely Eisenhower had dominated him. The arrogance evaporated. The lecturing tone vanished. "I accept your terms," Montgomery reportedly said, his voice quiet. "You have my full cooperation." Eisenhower studied him for a long moment, ensuring the surrender was genuine. Then he nodded. "Good, then we understand each other. This meeting is over." As Montgomery left the room, stripped of his pretensions, Eisenhower sat back down. He sat in silence for several minutes before turning to Bedell Smith. "I should have done that 6 months ago," Ike said. "The British won't like it," Smith warned. "The British will understand it," Eisenhower replied. "Churchill already understands it. That's why you won't fight me on this." Eisenhower was right. When word of the confrontation reached London, Churchill's response was pragmatic. He told his military chiefs, "Eisenhower has asserted his authority. About time, I'd say." Montgomery needed to hear it. Asterisk, asterisk, the aftermath. A shift in power, the proof of Eisenhower's victory, lay in what followed. Montgomery sent a letter to Eisenhower the next day drafted, "Historian suspect," under immense pressure from his own staff, who feared he was about to be fired. The letter was stiff, formal, and humiliating for a man of Montgomery's ego. It expressed full confidence in Eisenhower's leadership and pledged complete loyalty. It was a public acknowledgement of submission. More importantly, Montgomery's influence over American forces effectively ended that day. For the remaining 4 months of the war, Montgomery commanded British and Canadian forces in the north. He performed well, crossing the Rhine and taking the surrender of German forces in the north. But he no longer had a voice in the grand strategy. When the time came to plan the final encirclement of the Ruhr and the drive toward the Elbe, Bradley and Patton had direct access to Eisenhower. Montgomery was given his orders like any other subordinate commander. When the Americans decided to halt at the Elbe rather than race the Soviets to Berlin, a decision Montgomery furiously opposed, his protests were ignored. The demotion was subtle, but it was absolute. Montgomery had been put in his place, and everyone in the Allied command structure knew it. Why it matters? Why does a private meeting in a cold office 80 years ago matter today? It matters because it serves as the definitive moment where the baton of global leadership passed from Great Britain to the United States. In 1942 and 1943, the British, with their mobilized empire and military experience, were the senior partners. They dictated strategy. They checked American enthusiasm with British caution. But by January 1945, the industrial and demographic weight of the United States had tipped the scales. American forces outnumbered the British 3-1. Eisenhower's confrontation was the moment this reality was made explicit. It wasn't just about Montgomery's bad manners. It was about establishing that American leadership of the Western world was now absolute and non-negotiable. it also reveals the steel behind Eisenhower's smile. History often remembers Ike as the grandfatherly president of the 1950s or the diplomatic manager of the war. We forget that he was a man capable of ruthless decision-making. He had spent years managing egos, absorbing criticism, and deflecting blame to keep the alliance together. But he understood a fundamental truth of leadership. Compromise has a limit. When compromise becomes weakness, when patience enables toxicity, a leader must exercise raw authority. Eisenhower was willing to humiliate the most famous general of his closest ally to save the integrity of the command. Montgomery never forgot the lesson. In his post-war memoirs, he was surprisingly restrained in his criticism of Eisenhower regarding this period. When asked about it years later, he would only say that Eisenhower had made his authority clear. It was the mark of a man who had been definitively defeated in a contest of wills. Eisenhower rarely spoke of it publicly, wishing to preserve post-war relations with Britain. But in private, he told an aide that the confrontation with Montgomery was one of the hardest things I had to do during the war, but also one of the most necessary. I liked Monty in many ways, but he couldn't see beyond his own ego. And in a coalition war, that's disqualifying. In that frozen January of 1945, Dwight Eisenhower stopped being a diplomat and started being a conqueror. He proved that Allied unity mattered more than British pride, and in doing so, he cemented his control over the forces that would liberate Europe. The meeting at Versailles didn't just silence a difficult general. It signaled the arrival of a new world order.